This is a marking knife I made about a year ago. It's got a simple tool steel blade and an oak handle, and I wanted to improve on this design. So today we're going to be using again a piece of tool steel from a saw to make our design. You can kind of see it right there on a piece of paper that I have drawn out. The tools I'm going to be using for this project are going to be very basic. You just saw me there cut off the piece that I'm going to use with a hacksaw, and now I'm just getting rid of the burrs with a file. I took measurements of the blade blank and transcribed them onto the piece of metal we're using for the blade. One of the reasons that this blade, which was originally hardened and tempered steel, is working so easily at the moment is because I put the steel into a fire and let it heat up nice and hot. That way it would get rid of the heat treat that was originally on this blade. If I didn't do this, then the steel would be way too hard and I wouldn't be able to work with it. As you can see, I'm now going to be removing the teeth from that piece of metal using a large file. We can just keep filing till we see all of the shadows gone from that top edge. And you can see that the piece of metal is not flat, so I just grabbed some pliers and straightened it out. We can now attach our blank, which I cut out from the piece of paper which was originally holding my design, and then use some spray adhesive to attach it to that piece of steel. Be careful not to use too much spray adhesive as it tends to slip around a bit and also not dry very quickly. We can now go back to the files and start abrading out the shape that we want. I started with nice light cuts to really establish what angle I'm going at, and then I started to go a little bit heavier and heavier as my control kind of got into a settled pace. There will be a link in the description where you can go find my Patreon, and on my Patreon at the moment there is a poll to decide what kind of wood I'm going to use for the handle of the marking knife. I've got a couple of options there. They're all very nice exotic hardwoods, and I think they'll all look amazing. If you would like to support the show, there's a few ways you can do so. Now, first and foremost, there's liking and subscribing, of course. You can also become a patron. My patrons get access to videos up to a week early. They also get behind-the-scenes pictures of projects I'm working on, as well as discounts on my merchandise. Another way you can support the show. Now, there is of course no pressure to donate or buy merchandise. Really the biggest way you can help me out is simply by liking, commenting, and subscribing. There's links up in the cards and in the description where you can find all of that. The shoulders for the blank are coming in very nicely. One of the things I really wanted to work on for this project is getting high quality finishes, so one step towards that is making sure that our shoulders look very nice on that blade. Right now I'm using a file that has one safe edge. That means that there's no teeth on one side. That means it doesn't cut on that side, which lets us go up right to an edge and not damage either side. I'm using some very fine cut files just to really tune in the shape. You may be able to hear a slight hum. That's from a dust extractor that I made. There's a link to that video up in the cards, and it's a very easy tool and cheap tool to make for the shop. Now you can see our finished form, and I believe that it's some of the best file work I've ever done on metal. And now I had to decide whether I would grind in the bevels of the blade before the heat treat or after the heat treat. I decided to do it after the heat treat, and you can see my janky little heat treating setup right there. I was heating up the blade with a little torch and then dunking it in the water to harden it. It was quite light outside, so I wasn't able to see the color of the blade. I did run a couple normalizing cycles, which gets rid of a lot of the stresses. To harden the blade, I just dunked it in some water. I'm not sure what type of steel it is, Some steels harden better by dunking them in water, some with oil, but I did the old test with a file, and it sounded like it hardened nice and easily. Unfortunately, my footage for tempering somehow got lost, so we're just going to skip straight to grinding. I think it's funny, because of the time-lapse here, of how the guards wiggled and wobbled. I ground in about a 25-degree bevel. I'm not sure if that's too steep or too shallow, as this is one of my first ever metalworking projects, but I think the bevels looked pretty nice in the end. And don't worry, I did make sure to sweep up all the sawdust around the area, and I had a fire extinguisher on hand right next to me at all times while I was grinding. This is mainly a woodworking shop, so there is a high danger of fires when working with the sparks. With the bevels roughed in, we could start cleaning up the blade, removing the oxides from the finishing. We're going to be using 220 grit, 320 grit, 400 grit, and 600 grit to get it a nice shine. So as you can see, we have a before. It's kind of rough, it's got oxides on it, but we can move on. I'm using a little bit of soapy water just to help get the sandpaper attached to the glass a little bit and lubricate the cut of the metal on the sandpaper. So right here, this is the 150 grit. I noticed that the edges of the sandpaper sort of rose up and it was a little annoying, but I worked through it. And now I believe this is the 600 grit. I skipped quite a few steps as the time lapses got quite boring. I made sure to make the bevels nice and shiny, as that's kind of the sign of a quality tool. I had to go to a new piece of 600 because that one got worn out, so that gives you a reference for how much time I spent on the sanding and polishing. Stay tuned for part 2. Part 2 we're going to be making the handle. And remember, there's a link in the description to where you can find a poll to vote on what wood we're going to use for the handle. I'll really love your input, and I can't wait to see you in the next video. If you like this video, please give it a like. If you really love what I'm doing here, feel free to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.